Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be pleasing to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. From the book of Job. When Job's 3 friends heard of all of these troubles that had come upon him, each of them set out from his home. Eliphaz the Temanite, Bildad the Shuhite, and Zophar the Naamathite. They met together to go and console and comfort Job. When they saw him from a distance, they did not recognize him, and they raised their voices and wept aloud. They tore their robes and threw dust in the air upon their heads. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. They sat with him on the ground 7 days and 7 nights, and no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. No one spoke a word, for sometimes in this life there are no words. No words that can ever adequately explain what has just happened. No words that can soothe or heal the torn and broken heart. Sometimes it's best to simply sit and keep quiet. Suffering can be very great. And the simple act of sitting alongside someone and honoring that suffering in silence, it is what is needed. What has happened to Job could happen to any one of us. Job was a righteous man, as Neil just shared with the children. He loved God. He worshiped God. And he loses everything. Job had what many people yearn for in this life: a family, a wife and children, a wonderful job with 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 oxen, and 500 donkeys, and many, many people to help him. In the book of Job, it is stated that he was considered the greatest of all the people of the East. He steered clear of evil. He taught his children to love and revere and worship God. Have you ever known anyone like this? Someone who seems to have it made. There's someone that everyone admires, and some people even envy because they have deep faith and they seem to have the greatest satisfactions of all of the stuff of this life. And then have you ever witnessed the terrible day when suffering arrives on their doorstep? Job experiences the breadth and depth of suffering. He loses it all. Children, livestock, his health. And his friends hear about the troubles and they come to visit. And what they see takes their breath away. For there are no words for his suffering. Suffering is a part of human life. Not one individual who lives and breathes will not suffer. It's part of the human condition. Suffering means to endure, to bear, to allow, to let in. And it comes in many forms. The love of our life tells us they don't love us anymore and they pack their bags and leave. And we have to figure out who we are without them. The job search is fruitless and we spend days worrying that the rainy day fund will run out and we won't have enough money to feed ourselves or our family. Suffering can come in the form of a medication that's just not helping, and the person we love is paralyzed with anxiety or depression. Suffering is watching our brother or sister drift away into the mindless, slow deterioration of dementia. It's the late night phone call that there's been an accident and your son or daughter has died. Suffering is the loneliness of walking into an empty house and realizing that the person that you have shared that home with is gone. Suffering is, you can fill in the blank. In this life, we will each endure or bear some adversity that will take our breath away. And of course, the story of Job is the penultimate example of suffering, in particular, the suffering of the innocent. It's a story that was originally an oral tale, told in many religious circles, including Egyptian and Babylonian religions, as well as in the Israelite nation. It's classified as wisdom literature, a style of writing that is quite different than most of the other books we find in the Bible. Wisdom literature does not give an overview of the history of God or God's people and the story of liberation and salvation. Wisdom literature takes an intimate approach at probing the depth of God's people and asking the questions of the meaning of life, examining what a person's relationship is with God in the midst of those questions. Wisdom literature like Ecclesiastes and Job both share the hard-to-hear truths about what it means to live in a broken, fragile world. These authors write with courage and honesty that life is not always joyful, happy, peaceful, or even life-giving. In fact, wisdom literature reminds people of faith that being faithful does not protect them or us from suffering. It boldly names the doubts and the despair that can happen when suffering arrives. It asks the dark questions that some Christians find blasphemous to whisper. Questions like, why do I exist if only to suffer? Why is this happening to me? I follow the rules, I read the Bible, I worship God. Why is God allowing me to suffer? Where is God right now? Why has God not stopped my pain? It seems that when life is going well, we rarely pause to reflect upon these questions, but when our world gets turned upside down and we suffer and we're most vulnerable, we ache for a deepening insight of who we are and who God is. This is when we lean into our faith. We search for reasons, understanding, and peace. And in doing so, we use our God-given intellect to think, to wonder, to revisit those things we thought we believed, but find we have more questions than answers. When we allow ourselves to ask those questions, we invite God into dialogue, and we are changed. Our perspective on this life grows, and our understanding of who we are and who God is deepens. To thoroughly grasp the complexity of the book of Job, it's imperative that we are open to a couple of things. Open to the fact that we may not agree with the ancient Israelite theology of God that the friends espouse, but that the story is still relevant to us today. Open to honoring Job's range of emotions that he exhibits. His doubts, his questions, his anger, his disbelief, his crying out to God to come and meet him in this pain. We also must be open to the fact that God does not give the satisfying answer that we would like to hear as to why an innocent man suffers. Finally, we must be open to the fact that sometimes we are like Job's well-intending friends, and it's important that we learn what they do well and what they don't do well when it is our turn to journey with someone who is suffering. This 6th century oral tale that traversed many different religions was so relevant that the Hebrew scholars placed it in the canon of the Bible. Those foundational questions of faith are universal for everyone who walks this earth. Each question could be a sermon in and of itself, and I won't try and answer them all today. I'm most struck by this ancient story and the community that forms when Job is in pain and what we can learn for it. As you and I have both experienced, most people we know, and most Americans, are not well versed in how to deal with other people's pain. It's uncomfortable, it's awkward, it's too raw and honest to deal with, and sometimes it even reminds us that this could be us suffering, and that frightens us. So what do? Well, most of us either avoid the suffering altogether, or we engage with the one who is suffering and we try and normalize it, rationalize it, or worse, we try and fix it. In the absence of knowledge and tools in our fix-it toolbox, we open our mouths and we utter these phrases that make those who receive the words wince. Phrases like, "It's all for the best." "You'll find someone new." "Well, you never really liked your job anyway." "What doesn't kill you makes you stronger." "God must be testing you." "Everything happens for a reason." "God never gives us more than we can bear." "Time will heal your wound." "Well, at least you got to say goodbye." "It could be a lot worse." "It must have been God's will." "At least she's at peace now." "Be brave and don't cry in front of the children." "God needed another angel in heaven." Those phrases never soothe the brokenhearted. More than any words, what the grief-stricken need is for us to show up, just like Job's friends do. Showing up is what matters most. They show up and they sit and they grieve with Job. And while they keep their mouths closed, Job is supported. Silence is what was needed most. For sometimes there are no words. Psychologist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross developed the 5 stages of grief that people go through when they suffer a loss. Some of you may know these very well. Anger, shock, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And these are not in a linear movement. People move in and out of these emotions and phases throughout their loss and their suffering. There are no term limits. Each person's grief is unique. As we see in the book of Job, shock comes first, an inability to comprehend and articulate what's happened. Psychologists call this a mute suffering. 7 days of silence. After the shock, Job is in much anger and pain and has a lot of doubts and questions. It's interesting that some Christian circles think that anger and questions and doubt are an insult to God, but I disagree. It is necessary and important for us to express God-given emotions. God can handle it. For Job, once he sees that his friends can handle his silence, he thinks it's safe to open his mouth and articulate all that he's feeling. He wishes he was never born. He cannot endure this pain. His words are filled with desperation. He thinks that dying would be better than living with this condition. He feels estranged from God, and he cannot find meaning. When we are with someone who's hurting, sometimes their thoughts and feelings make us uncomfortable. And that's what happened to Job's friends. They did not like the way Job was reacting, so what do? Explain it, normalize it, fix it, minimalize it. His friends try and help by explaining that what has happened is what was theologically understood at the time. There were rewards and there were punishments from God. Virtue was rewarded by prosperity, health, and long living. And conversely, sins were punished with poverty, sickness, and untimely death. Eliphaz suggests there must be a flaw inside of Job. And Job needs to confess that flaw and repent. And Job says, no, I have done nothing to deserve this. Bildad and Zophar dig in their heels and they tout theology of reward and punishment. And then they say, Job, you're being prideful. You think you're so righteous. Well, there you go. There's your sin. You need to repent. But the truth is there was no rational reason. Suffering happens. And no theological doctrine in the world can bring comfort or peace to Job. It is in this injustice that Job finds a voice to call upon God to come and meet him in the pain. He shouts like a defiant, petulant child. God can handle it. You know, it would behoove Job's friends, just as Neil shared with the kids, and it would behoove us to remember that sometimes there are no words. And towards the end of 3 rounds of dialogue between Job and his friends, Bildad starts to run out. You'll notice in the book as you read it, he goes from long 20 to 30 verses to 6 verses. And when it's Zophar's final turn, they turn to him, he just goes like this. Silence. Theologian Henry Nouwen wrote, "When we honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives means the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving advice, solution, or cures, they are the ones who have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a warm and tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us an hour of grief or bereavement, who can tolerate the not knowing, not curing, not healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness, that is a friend who cares." Do you know who you will call upon when the suffering arrives? Kate Baystrup is a middle-aged mom of 4 who works primarily with young men who are game wardens for the state of Maine. She is a chaplain. She loves words, and she's a published author. And she writes this book called Here If You Need Me. As a chaplain, she doesn't get to use her words. She says her role is to show up, shut up, and just be. Be present with people while the game wardens find their missing loved ones who are lost in the beautiful nature, forests and lakes of Maine. She considers herself most to resemble the priest from the 1970s TV series MASH. Some of you will remember MASH. She writes, "I, like him, am a generic ecumenical clergy person. I represent the God that even atheists pray to in the foxholes. I wear a clerical collar, and when I arrive, I often tell people their loved one has died, and all I can do is hold them while they weep." She says, "I'm also one of the people who responds to game wardens when something miserable or scary happens to them. And I'm not the only person who responds, and I'm not the most important one, because what someone really needs when in trouble is the familiar, solid love of a spouse or a friend, the softness of a child's cheek against their face, the voice of a friend on the phone. But when I show up, they usually say to me, 'I'm so glad you're here because I'm about to freak out and I don't want to freak out.' And this is what she says, 'I'm here to be with you while you freak out, while you grieve, laugh, suffer, or sing. My job is a ministry of presence, showing up with a loving heart.'" The ministry of presence. That is what Job's friends do well in our passage this morning. They acknowledge the suffering, and they sit with Job, and they honor that it is awful, and it's heavy, and it hurts. That is what we are to remember this morning as a faith community. No one should suffer alone. No one. The ministry of presence is the greatest gift we can give to one another. If you have to put it in your head, remember what Baystrup says. Show up, shut up, and just be. Suffering doesn't have a clock, and the work of grief is long and often very lonely. We must keep showing up. As Christians, our role model is Jesus. Throughout the Gospels, Jesus showed up for those who were suffering the most. He broke down the social norms and barriers that keep those who suffer in silence, and he did it with 5 things. You can add your own. This is what I see when I read those stories from the Gospels. He saw the people who suffered. He called them by name. He touched them. He restored them to community so they weren't alone, and he loved them unconditionally. Jesus showed up. When we suffer, we do often feel utterly alone. And what is imperative is for us to remember that we are claimed by God, and that if we will be vulnerable and honest, there is someone there to journey with us. For the news of suffering is every day, and people go back to routines. It's no longer a big deal. And when you're left alone with your suffering, it's hard. One of our very own church members is currently being treated for cancer. A wife and mother in her 40s, a daughter of God, and with her permission, she has allowed me to share with you some thoughts from her journal about the ministry of presence. April 8th. To say the first week of chemo was difficult is an understatement. The exhaustion was unexpected and overwhelming. As I am forced to come to terms with this new reality, it is a struggle for the planner in me to live one day at a time. There is no way to express how much gratitude I have for all of you who have reached out in so many ways to show you care. April 15th. This being Holy Week, I've given a lot of thought to the crosses that each of us bear. Since right now I still know I look the same, I feel like a poster child saying, you never know what someone else is going through. I know that many of you have your own crosses to bear, and I pray for you and think of you, my friends. But Jesus did not carry his cross alone, and we are not going through this alone. Thank you all for your prayers, your texts, your meals, offers to help. May 16th. Yesterday was my 4th chemo treatment. The treatment was pretty uneventful, but a very long day. I am so thankful for the 4 people who were my chemo sitters yesterday. They are the best distraction, each in their unique way. June 10th. For now, we continue to be blessed and showered with so many numerous acts of kindness. It is truly overwhelming, the amount of support I have received. Please know every card, every text, every meal, every visit, and every secret surprise does brighten my day. Show up over and over again.